thought, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. Like
It's my great pleasure.
when I I remember distinctly where I was when I read Publicly Shamed. I'd gone to Japan in my increasingly side hustle as a music journalist to interview a band, and
Mm.
there was some problem with the flights getting back, and we were put into this swanky airport lounge, and I read it cover to cover, and I had a like an experience with internet pylons probably maybe like 6 months after that, and there were moments during that experience which was horrendous, and still lingers to this day when I allow it to, where I honestly thought if I hadn't read that book as almost preparation, things would have been a lot worse. So thank
Mm.
you for that.
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm very pleased that it helped. Of course, I would say that it wasn't what was in my book that got you through. It was your own inner resolve. But if my book kind of helped at all in any way, then I'm delighted.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. There was also the fact that my little brother, I say little brother, he's in his early 30s, was hilarious throughout when everyone else was sort of offering, kind of,
Yeah.
well, not everyone, because the thing that's horrible about those experiences is you sort of realise who's got your back and who hasn't. But
Mm.
um, whilst there was a lot of, oh, you'll be okay, you've got this, my brother was so irreverent and hilarious that actually there were moments where he really did force me to laugh at it. So I
Oh,
thought
good.
there was a moment where I thought my career as a journalist is over now, and he said to me he's a big fan of wrestling, professional
Mm.
wrestling, and you know the luchadors, they wear masks.
Right. You mean
Uh,
like the sort of the Mexican wrestlers?
yeah. They're
Yeah.
called, they're called luchadors,
Okay.
and I was like, oh, I'll never get any work ever again. No one will ever commission me. And um, he said to me, he said, no, what you want to do is you want to put a lucha mask on, and uh, and then kind of like you can do all your writing kind of, but as like a sort of masked man, and then after a year you can take your mask off and just be like, it's me, motherfuckers, and that was really what I needed to hear
Yeah.
when I was on the edge. So
People have done that. I think Hugh Laurie did it. J.K. Rowling did it.
yeah, pen names.
Yeah, yeah, pen names because they're worried. I understand that worry.
Yeah,
Uh, mm.
absolutely. I feel like there's so many journalists who we all sort of say it in private, really, but anyway, I used to have a pen name when I worked at the NME, but it was sort of
What was
getting.
it?
I think there
Were
was.
you Everett True?
There wasn't Everett True, although he will. I
Were
do
you the
know.
legend?
I do know Everett True, and he'll be delighted that you've just mentioned his name. Is that a name from back in your pop star past?
Yeah, I was one of the first things I did, in my early 20s was the enemy never accepted me. I was managing a band called the Man from Del Monte. I'm playing in Frank Sidebottom's band. And Frank Sidebottom had a certain cachet in the enemy world, but the Man from Del Monte did not. People thought that the band was too middle class, too fey. I think there was like an accident of timing. The Man from Del Monte were in there was a sort of hierarchy of the Smiths gave the world James, and James was about to give the world the man from Del Monte. We were all of a sort of similar vibe. But then Manchester happened, and the Inspired Carpets and the Stone Roses came along, and they were much more working class, and Martha Del Monte was more art school. So we were never accepted by the NME, but we were accepted by Sounds and Melody Maker a little bit better. And so I started working for Sounds. Actually, I wrote some early stuff for Sounds and for Smash Hits, and so really I started very briefly as a writer for music magazines, but it didn't last long at all, like months.
Yeah, there was, without sort of without sort of dropping too many names. I had a conversation with Caitlin Moran once when she was talking about how the music press was just, I don't know, it's one of the things that's kind of sad about its demise is that for me, for example, like a working class kid who was told he would amount to nothing, to just by means of almost kind of learning a vocabulary from reading The Enemy and then learning about fanzines, and then it led to me having a career in media where I would have never have got in via connections or anything like that, and it just sort of feels a bit of a shame, really, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I agree.
Anyway, so yeah, shame. So, like I say, huge inspiration in me starting this podcast, and it has been a really illuminating experience. I feel like every episode, someone from all walks of life and all experiences of shame have left me thinking about the subject matter differently.
Okay.
I guess what
I've listened to a couple, by the way, of your shows. I listened to Kat Rosenfield, which I thought was really good. I like her very much. I discovered Kat Rosenfield when she wrote that piece about, you know, the tensions within the young adult fiction world, which I thought was like just so interesting. And I've been a fan of hers ever since.
Yeah,
and Amanda Knox too, who I know. So I've listened to a few of your episodes and enjoyed them very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, totally. I think. Well, I guess what I was going to say before we kind of get into the sort of the guts of it. So, you know, we're a significant period of time since the book came out. Do you feel like people still? There was this strange phenomenon for a while of like every time there'd been like an online lynching, where people would almost come to you to, almost like
adjudicate.
Exactly,
like the shame, like my friend John Safran, the Australian journalist, said I'd become like a shaming imam.
Absolutely, yeah. Do you still feel like that?
At the top of my mountain. Yeah, it doesn't really happen anymore. I very deliberately distanced myself from it. I just found it. I can't really put my finger quite on why, because a lot of the writers who really carried on with that beat have done very well. You know, they've got like huge Substacks and, you know, Patreons. But I just didn't want to be. I could feel myself being pulled into being a single issue writer. And I just didn't want to do that. I just didn't want to. I didn't want to be like a plaything of people who didn't like what I was writing about, where I'd be a meme. I just didn't want. That just felt, you know, I just didn't want. I just didn't want that. And I also think as a journalist, you shouldn't restrict yourself to one particular subject matter, because what will happen, like if you become Mr. Shame, what's going to happen? You're going to get caricatured. You're going to caricature yourself. Which is very easy to do. So I deliberately distanced myself and I kind of stopped that from happening. I turned down, you know, hundreds of interviews about shaming stuff over the years. Not that I didn't, it wasn't because I no longer cared about the issue. I cared about it very much, but I just felt like I was being hemmed in. Like my life wasn't in my control anymore.
Yeah, no, it's totally understandable. I think though that did you? I mean, this stuff was obviously going on when you wrote your book, but it feels like so pertinent at the present moment. So therefore, like your stuff feels with hindsight really precedent. Did you imagine that it would continue and be amplified in such a way, or did you think that it would be a moment that we would have passed by now?
No, I think I had an inkling when I was writing it that this was like something big. Like I had noticed something that few people had noticed, that there was this significant change to how we regarded each other as human beings. The, you know, curiosity and empathy was going out the window a little bit. Well, there's still a lot of empathy on social media, but it's selective empathy. It's empathy within your own group. with a lack of curiosity for people who were in different groups. So I noticed all of this stuff happening, disproportionate punishments. People were being punished without being given a chance to explain what they meant. You know, people's lives were being torn apart while they were asleep on a plane, which is one of the main stories from that book. I remember a few times. I remember showing my wife the Justine Sacco story. I think the moment when I thought, okay, this could actually turn into something significant was when I showed the Justine Sacco story to my wife. I was the only person to interview Justine Sacco, who was like the ground zero of public shaming. She was like the AIDS tweet woman. And my wife just couldn't believe it. Like I was staring at her as she was reading it, and her face was just like, I can't believe that this happened to this person. This is incredible. And I think that's when I knew, wow, if I've galvanized my wife, then I'll be other people will feel galvanized.
God, our wives really do. I'd be nothing without mine. I guess the other thing is though as well is that you said a few times about how Twitter is rewiring our brains, or it's changing the way that we think. And I'm not sure. At the time when you said that, I maybe thought that it was slightly sensationalist at the time when I read it, but I think it's beyond question now.
Yeah, I heard someone say the other day talking about CBT, and they said, I wish I can't remember the context, but it was said that it may have even been you, because I was listening to one of the podcasts just the other day, that in CBT they say that thoughts can lead to mental illness. And I do think there's an argument that our brains are being rewired by Twitter, and Twitter is causing mental illness. I think CBT people would probably say that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost trying to make a bit of a pact with myself not to when I do podcasts to talk about OCD so much, but I have OCD, and it's something that is really. It's almost like the filter that I see the world through from having it for such a long time. And absolutely, I mean, the whole thing with CBT and its application for OCD is trying to change how you think, how you interpret thoughts, and that thoughts are just thoughts, and they don't have any purpose unless you attach it to it. So it's unquestionable that it's possible. I think the thing I guess where I was almost going to go with it was that there's a guy, I reference this nameless friend of mine on this podcast quite a lot, and we were having a conversation recently about the, for want of a better term, like the dog park Karens. And
so first Amy Cooper and then Emma Sarley. Was that the name of this?
Emma Sarley. I think it was Emma Sarley in particular. And he was.
They got treated in very different ways, Amy Cooper and Emma Sarley, I noticed.
Well, he's like I love the guy, but he's like a Manhattan dwelling, a Williamsburg. I don't know New York very well. Like he's almost sort of your. He's a hip guy that loves Bernie, right? And I would have these conversations with him, and I would say, this is really wrong the way that she was treated, and even if it wasn't wrong, the rush to judgment is frightening. And he couldn't get it at all. Like, he really thought that her actions were indicative of the rise of white supremacy. And I really wondered whether that was, his brain being twisted in some way, or the kind of mental gymnastics there kind of alarm me.
Well, actually, episode 8, so I've got this new show out called Things Fell Apart, which is stories from the history of the culture wars. And in fact, the final episode 8, which I finished this morning, is about, and by the way, the whole series Things Fell Apart is going to be on all the podcast platforms from January the 25th.
Good work. I got that in my intro, but good work.
Right. I just want people to know that.
I'll say it at the end as well.
Yeah, the more just repeatedly say it. But the final episode is about anti-racism and critical race theory and so on, and it sounds to me like what your friend is feeling is that America is based on systemic racism. White people inherently benefit from this systemic racism, and there is such a thing as implicit bias and microaggressions and so on, and that is probably the ideological framework that your friend was coming from when he says that Emerson, did do things that would be worthy of criticism. So he's coming from an ideological framework that's become very popular in America.
Yeah, but I agree. But what I can't really work out is, I just don't accept that he thinks he's right. But it feels like something that he can't. It feels like something that he can't maintain his sense of self and disagree with. Does that make sense?
I mean, to try and put myself in his shoes for a minute, and of course, I have complicated, nuanced feelings about this, and like all cultural conflicts. But to put yourself in his shoes for a minute, what he's probably thinking is that America is built on racism. 1.2 million people were sold between 1760 and 1860 in town squares and taverns, and this is like the fundament of America. And white people have always benefited from systemic racism, and systemic racism really is real, and this is a very real thing. And what are you going to do about it? Are you going to do nothing, or are you going to do something? Are you going to be like, no? So within that framework, like, there really is an elephant in the room that really needs to be dealt with, or it's just going to go on forever. In that framework, he would probably think, well, Emerson, does represent. So my personal view is that, everything that critical race theory teaches, I say everything, like I have a very minor knowledge of it, but what I know about critical race theory absolutely rings true. But if somebody's punishment is disproportionate, you still need to worry about that. So Emersali's case, for me, doesn't fit into that framework because of the other stuff that was going on.
Just context.
Yeah, context, and also the fact that there was a slither of a video that this guy was posting. I don't know, is it necessary to tell the whole story of what happened in the dog park to let listeners understand?
I think on previous episodes I've wanged on about it.
Okay, so where were we? I've forgotten, I've lost my train of thought.
About the kind of the slither of the video that this was.
That's right, it was a slither of the video. This was a guy who had done similar things before. He was staying at an Airbnb, I think, and there was some erotic paintings on the wall, and he so he's sort of done this a couple of times. So I did notice something really interesting happened as a result of the Emersali thing, which is that Nicole Hannah-Jones, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who created the 1619 project for the New York Times, she came out and said, like, I don't think the shaming of this woman is appropriate. It's like, this isn't an appropriate use of this man's platform.
Yeah.
Which I thought was very interesting, because nobody did that. That felt new. That felt like a newer and more nuanced conversation about how to deal with Emersali. And I know she lost her job and she had to move away from New York, but I don't believe that it's following her in the same way that it follows Amy Cooper. Yeah. So I think there has been a more nuanced. It's people are treating her case in a more nuanced way, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I think so too, and I think that actually that that sort of defence of my friend makes an awful lot of sense. Actually, I guess while we're on,
I'm not saying that I agree with it, because I do feel that Emersali was treated poorly. But I also very much understand like where people are coming from when they feel that way.
I agree. I guess maybe more cynically, I'm maybe just feeling like, I don't know, that maybe it's an issue of sort of personal identity. I sometimes feel, you know, I feel, I think I'm very left leaning, and one of the things I find quite difficult about conversations about things like cancel culture, or like, I don't want to be on the same side as Tucker Carlson,
Yeah.
but
God,
no,
sorry.
but my politics have always been very humanist, and it's about people, and I sort of waffling on really a little bit there, but I think that there are those issues that you feel like it's difficult to go near because you don't want to lose your tribe, so to speak.
Well, here's the problem. The reason why you mentioned Tucker Carlson just then was, there's a real problem with the phrase cancel culture, which is that it incorporates wildly differing sets of circumstances. So on the one hand, you've got the kind of people that I wrote about in Saved and Publicly Shamed, which is private individuals who were disproportionately punished for pretty minor transgression. Then in the middle, you've got, public figures, newspaper columnists, agent provocateur columnists, who, when there's pushback, which is sometimes extremely severe pushback, they say they're being cancelled in a similar way. And then you've got politicians who sexually assault people who complain that they're being cancelled if they're called to account for it. So those three things are all entirely different from each other and should be treated in entirely different ways. And that's the problem. I'm sure you don't feel that that a politician who sexually assaults someone, it is being unfairly treated. So you could. So I think, but you know what? I would say both the right and the left have done something irritating when it comes to that phrase, cancel culture. Just shoved everything into the same box. And now it's impossible to have a nuanced conversation about it because, 1 minute you're talking about Justine Sacco, and the next minute you're talking about a pedophile politician from, Middle America.
Yeah.
It's like, it just makes everything dizzying and confusing. So I would advocate, ending the phrase cancel culture because it just doesn't do any good for anyone.
Yeah, I think it was actually Kat Rosenfeld who I'm sure I saw. I'm sure. I mean, she's nice, so she can have the credit for it. But I think I saw her argue for the case of cursed culture, like this idea that when you have been shamed, and I say this from my own sort of personal experience, that it doesn't. There's this kind of, people like grifters on the internet will say, oh, well, it's just people being mean on the internet, boo-hoo. But this stuff, like, I remember when it happened to me, being stood in the supermarket and thinking, are people looking at me? And they weren't looking at me. I mean, who am I? But it follows you about, and I actually thought that was a really good phrase.
Yeah. Oh, it does. I think shamers don't realize until it happens to them. This was one of the real revelations I had when I was writing Saved and Publicly Shamed. The level of psychological trauma that people experience as a result of being publicly shamed is way more severe than I think the shamers realize. It fundamentally gets something at the very core, fundamentally prods away at something at the very core of humanity that you thought. And this is why it's always much worse when you're being shamed by your own group. Like, when white supremacists go after me, like, I don't really care very much. Just like they're white supremacists, like, sure. When it's your own people going after you, fuck, that's when it hurts. And I think people don't realize that because humans are, we're social. We want to be part of a community. And when you're told, no, get out of the village, like you don't belong here, get out. That's agony for people, and that's why some people commit suicide.
I mean, coming back to the politics thing, though, one thing that I don't know whether it's a happening that you've observed, but because of that, because almost the term, because like online shaming or cancel culture, or whatever you want to call it, has been deployed as it's been weaponized. I have noticed that, say, when what happened to Emma Sarley happened, that racists would, they tried quite hard to adopt her. That she was almost like indicative of, oh, it's all gone too far. And
Yeah.
and
That's what happened to Justine Sacco. One of the first job offers she got after the AIDS tweet was from a guy who ran like a yachting company in Florida. And she was immediately like, why is this guy offering me a job? I don't know anything about yachts. And, clearly it was for similar.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, I quite like. I definitely feel like there is almost this. There is almost like a sort of a community of people who have experienced this that are friendly. A lot of them, like within the media sphere, like a Jessie Singal or a Katie Herzog or someone that almost kind of, I don't know, almost like had their faith in people sort of bashed to such an extent that they found each other. I don't want to get all kind of like, red pill or all that, but it does feel like that.
Oh, absolutely. And which I completely understand. I mean, I've put shamed people together, and we know that it happens, all the time. I mean, there was that piece, the intellectual dark web piece in the New York Times. Shamed people do seek each other out because the cure for shame is empathy. So it's completely understandable that why they would do that. There's a psychological need to do it. You need to seek people out who've been through the same experience that you've been through.
That was the moment of the episode where someone said something that really clicked with me. Like, I kind of knew that, but actually, yeah, the cure for shame is empathy. I'm not sure I'd kind of thought about it in such a distilled way as that.
Yeah, no, that became very clear to me when I was writing Saving Publicly Shamed. And then one of the very first things I did after the book came out was I did an event with Brene Brown in Boston. It's a big event in Boston. And she has come, independently. I think she came up with exactly the same phrase, pretty much. The cure for shame is empathy.
Yeah, totally. Do you think that being shamed makes you more empathetic?
It's funny. Like if you're terribly bullied at school, it feels like often it can go one of two ways. You either become much more empathetic and anti-bullying and more sensitive, and you don't want anybody to go through what you've been through, or you become a bully. So it can go either way. James, can we take 20 seconds? I could just go and use the bathroom for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'll be back by the time the clock strikes.
It's all good. Take your time. Wash your hands.
Okay, all right. I'll be a minute. Okay, see you in a sec. Hello, I'm back.
Cool.
Thank you for waiting.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, so you either become like an anti-bullying advocate, or you become a bully. It's interesting, right? That people can go through the same experience, can go one way or the other.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I was pretty badly bullied as an 11-year-old. I've heard you talk about your experiences, and it definitely shaped me. Though to my shame, I do feel quite a lot of shame about it. Actually, I kind of became like not popular, but like accepted afterwards. And there are times where I think about like not that I wasn't a bully, but that I was an onlooker, because I was almost so delighted to not be on the end of it. And
well, I mean, that's understandable that people feel that way. And of course, that happens on social media too. Like if someone else is being powed in on, there's less chance that it's going to be you that's being powed in on that day. So
yeah. What's that phrase? There's almost that way of thinking of trying to make it through the day without being the main story.
Yeah, the main player on Twitter. Yeah, when I first heard that phrase, I thought that was a good phrase, and I've completely now forgotten it.
We were talking about nuance a minute ago, and one thing that befuddles me is that, say on the left, and I'm very interested in like prison reform. I think prisons are in a state. There's a lot of, I mean, to be honest, on a certain day, I could maybe argue that I don't believe in prison, but there's talk about kind of wrongful convictions and rightly so. But then it's also almost like the same people can be at the heart of shaming for relatively minor misdeeds, and those two things sit really uneasily with me.
Yeah.
Like,
by the way, if you go on, sorry.
No, sorry. Almost like the selective nature of the empathy there.
Yeah, empathy on Twitter is selective. It's very selective. Twitter, I say this unashamed, but I'm to paraphrase myself. Twitter can feel like a stage for constant artificial high drama where everybody's either a magnificent hero or a sickening villain. In the early days of Twitter, I do remember like somebody would be plucked out as like the world's greatest hero. I remember thinking, obviously that's nicer than piling in on someone, but in a way it's part of the same problem. Like, if we identify people as being magnificent heroes, then it's going to be more likely that we'll identify people as being sickening villains. I think that the more healthy way to think about our fellow humans is that we're a mix of all sorts of things. We're grey areas. The heroic people do terrible things. Terrible people can do heroic things. We're a mess, and we shouldn't be trying to shove people into those boxes.
Is there a way? I mean, one of the things I with the book that I remember thinking that I really liked the payoff of the book, that almost that there was this tool for communication, and maybe it'll make us kind of shut up, and that would be a shame. And I thought that was really good. I don't know how much you have thought about solutions, or whether that's even something that you think would be in your remit. But
no, I do think that one should think about solutions.
But I guess, you're almost kind of arguing for us to see each other as humans and not snapshots of humans.
Yeah.
How is that possible?
Well, I'll tell you what. Episode 3 of Things Fell Apart, which is an episode about how the televangelist Tammy Faye Baker brought onto her show, she was part of a very homophobic world, and this was at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, and she brought onto her show a gay pastor with AIDS, Steve Peters. And I think now, 6 of the 8 episodes have now aired, and that's the episode that people talk about the most. And it's very moving and very emotional, and it's all about connection. Tammy interviews Steve, these two, from enemy camps, and they come together, and it's profoundly moving. And I've had so many messages from people saying that they were sobbing while listening to the episode and so on. And I think that's partly because hearing their audio is very moving anyway, but also I think it's because it's touching something in us that, like, I think we're all a little bit battle scarred, and we want to have connection with people, and I think that's part of the reason why people felt so moved. So I think the answer is connection, but how we get there, I haven't figured out.
Yeah, no, we need to sort of get into Silicon Valley and rewire the algorithms.
Well, I mean, a little bit of that is happening to an extent. I was really interested in the fact that Peter Thiel, I talk about this in episode 5 of Things Fell Apart, how Peter Thiel, who epitomizes the libertarian engineering utopian culture of Silicon Valley, ended up, after 30 years living there, ended up moving to Los Angeles because he felt that wasn't culture in Silicon Valley anymore. It wasn't a libertarian utopian culture anymore. So it feels like things are starting to change.
I always feel a bit confused about Peter Thiel, to be honest, because it's kind of strange that you can have. It's kind of strange that you can. The hill that you will die on is sort of personal freedoms and free speech, but then you'll go close an online publication. I thought that was
certainly. I'd recommend. I've been reading quite a lot about Peter Thiel lately, just because he is such an exceptional such an exceptional person. I use, I mean, not in a sort of, he's exceptionally great, but just he's exceptional. And so I've been reading a lot about him recently. And yes, I agree. I think that's a very complicated aspect of Peter Thiel, but maybe not so complicated. Maybe right-wing libertarians are always just libertarian in the way that they want to be libertarian. Maybe that, as opposed to bestowing their ideology onto people who aren't in their tribe.
I wonder who'll play him in the inevitable Hulk Hogan biopic.
Well, it would have been Armie Hammer.
That's not happening.
That's not happening.
With I always say, like the people I write about, the people I speak to, I always try to stay in touch with them. I've written quite a lot about true crime and try and keep in touch with families and things like that. And I'm not as good as I should be. Do you still say, like Justine? Like, do you still keep in touch and check how she's doing?
I don't keep in touch with her. We come from such different worlds. She likes going to bars. Like if I was gonna, she's like a late night bar person, and I'm a sleep at 9 p.m. person. Yeah. So I haven't really kept in touch. But I did get the odd message from her. I got some really nice messages from Justine. When I was hustling, trying to talk her into being in my book, I was quite passionate. I was like, I think there's been an injustice, and I think, if I write about it, people will see that there's been an injustice, and I feel really strongly about it. And she took a lot of convincing, but I think, history has proven that story I wrote about her did really help to turn her life around, because it did make people see the incident differently. And so I've had a couple of nice messages from her. I keep in touch with some people who I've written. Monica Lewinsky, somebody who I've written about, who I've stayed friends with.
Do you feel like the majority of people? I mean, we were saying about how this stuff sticks to you. You feel stained by it, but do you feel like, I don't know, like 5 years down the line or what have you? Do you feel like the majority of people are in a better place, or?
I think we're heading into a better place. I think there's been a lot of good progress. Obviously.
I kind of mean them personally, to be honest.
Oh, personally. Yeah. Well, take Justine Sacco. She had a year of, like, her punishment was kind of a year in purgatory for, the crime of a poorly worded liberal joke. A bad example of what's actually a good comedic tradition of people mocking their own privilege and so on. So for her it was like a year. Maybe, obviously it's going to vary from person to person, but a year feels like a good solid number of, like, if you distance yourself, if you go off social media, come back after a year, things. Hey there.
Hey. Are you all right for about another sort of 10 minutes or so? Is that all right?
Sure, absolutely. I'm feeling slightly tired because I kind of finished the series yesterday, so I suddenly feel like a, how when you finish a great big piece of work, you suddenly sort of collapse a little bit. So I'm in that slightly collapsed frame of mind. But
absolutely, I had COVID a couple of months ago, and I'm still having sort of 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock pangs of lethargy.
Oh dear.
So yeah, you were saying so. I guess what I'm trying to get to, say, with if we're saying Justine, for example, like, do you, like, is she in employment now? Is this?
Oh yeah. She's in a much better place. She's got. In fact, she's now back. Well, the last I heard was that she was back working for the original company that fired her. Right. They own, like, internet sites, like they've got this beautiful building on the Hudson River in the city. I've completely forgotten the name of the company, though.
Right.
3 letters. So I think she's back there. So I think her life is basically like normal again.
Right.
or as normal as possible, with this always following her around. I mean, it's going to be weird that there was like a scene in Family Guy which was about her, and
Yeah.
my piece of the excerpt from "So You've Been Publicly Shamed" about her was the most viral newspaper, because it was excerpted in the New York Times, and it's one of the most viral articles that I've ever written. So all of that is going to be like following her around, but I think her life is pretty back to normal now.
What about the work that you did, like with the butterfly effects? Like, because I wondered whether, I wondered whether, I wonder how much sort of shame plays a part within that industry as well. Like people who found themselves within it and then didn't want to be in it anymore. Did that ever come up in conversations with people?
Oh yeah, a lot. I mean, there's one school of thought within the porn business that all the problems are on the outside. It's the hypocrisies of the outside world that cause the most problem to porn performers. So I tell one story in The Butterfly Effect about a porn performer called Dale DeBone, who quit porn to become a nurse and was doing brilliantly. And then he was called in. HR, somebody had spotted one of his films on Pornhub and was fired because he was told that if there's ever any sexual harassment allegations, you're just going to automatically lose if you've been in porn. So that's an example of, it's not the industry that caused shame and caused problems in his life. It was the outside world that did it. First, the tech bros who made his films so easy to find by creating Pornhub and so on. And second, the HR department at the hospital. I mean, how did they know he was in porn? Somebody would have noticed him in a porn film. But I'd say that there's also shame within the industry. I'm sure that there's a lot of people in the industry who were sexually abused and are now, working it through to an extent via being in porn. So there's going to be complicated stuff going on like that.
Yeah. I'm going to slightly timestamp this conversation and say that when we're talking, I've just listened to the episode of your new series that is about, quote unquote, the trans wars. I can't think of a more. I don't know what the phrase is.
Anxiety-inducing?
I can't think of an issue that I would want to go near less.
Yeah. Oh, me too. Believe me.
And I thought, without blowing smoke up your arse, I thought you dealt with it brilliantly because you presented the people, like that you presented the humans within the cast as opposed to the issue. Like,
yeah.
Did you have any? I wondered on the issue of shame whether you had any fear of it before pressing upload.
With that story, sure, but I would say not immediately before the story aired. In fact, a friend of mine who's a very prominent gender critical person, she heard the show. Like, I didn't send it to her, but I'd given her access to all the episodes. And what I didn't realize was that as new episodes were finished, they would like go into the box that I'd sent her. So without realizing, she heard the show, and about a week before it aired, and she's a pretty outspoken GC person, and she was like, "Oh, I love it! I loved it." And I was like, "So does that mean that trans people won't like it?" And she was like, "No, I think everyone will love it." So I was actually quite relaxed, and there hasn't been a massive amount of pushback. I had no pushback at all for any of the other episodes, and there's been a little bit of pushback for this episode, which obviously I'm not, pleased about, because my ambition for the series was to tell a story about the culture wars that doesn't become a part of the culture wars, and that's happened a little bit with the last episode. But no, I felt like I couldn't. I felt I could not do it. Like, if I'm telling a story about the history of the culture wars, the only thing that Radio 4 said to me when they commissioned it is, you've got to do something about trans rights, because it's just so overwhelmingly what people are talking about within context of the culture wars in Britain. So you've got to do something. And that was like the only guidance they gave me. And I thought, well, I really very much don't want to do anything on that topic, but
Yeah.
but I understand that I have to.
Right.
And sure enough, the very first interview I gave for Things Fell Apart was with Sunday Times, and she said to me, "I've noticed that you've stayed away from trans rights." I was like pretty much her first question of the first interview, which validated the fact that I had to do something. So I said to her, "Actually, no, there is going to be an episode. We just haven't finished making it yet." So I had to do it. I didn't want to do it. I think it's had as calm. I wish it had had an entirely calm response, but it's had a mainly calm response. So that's
One of my takeaways from this series so far is that I don't know. I think I maybe. I mean, I'm a bit younger than you. I'm 41, and I think I maybe thought that the climate was a relatively modern. A relatively modern phenomenon, but I think I've just realised. I mean, did you come away from this series thinking that inherently there is just something about us as humans that cannot get along?
Well, we have been fighting the same war. The culture war, it keeps mutating, turning into something else, but it's really the same war that's being fought since the early 1970s, which is really when the modern culture wars began. It's really interesting that that Christian evangelists really weren't part of the culture wars from the end of the 20s right through into the beginning of the 1970s. They opted out entirely. They were going to their own churches, consuming their own media. They just weren't part of mainstream society. They were like separatists. And then in the early 1970s, what galvanized them into becoming culture warriors was really busing and diversity of thought in school textbooks, which is what episode 2 of Things Fell Apart is about. So I suppose it's kind of ironic, well, not ironic, it's interesting that the biggest culture wars that are going on in America today are also happening in school boards. So what began the culture wars was fights over school curriculum, and that's where we are now. It's all about fights over school curriculum in America. In Britain, it's more about trans rights. So probably yes. There's a conservative brain, and there's the progressive brain, and I think they're probably very different brains, and I think that's always going to be a problem.
Get me off the hamster wheel. That's what I say.
Mm.
Thanks so much for speaking to me, John. I wanted to have a conversation with you for such a long time. Such a big fan of your work.
Thank you. Well, I hope it's been all right. I haven't been too lackadaisical in my responses due to the tiredness of having just finished the show.
No, not at all. And congratulations on it. Do you want to just remind people about where they can hear it? And
yes, so it's Things Fell Apart. It's 8 stories from the history of the culture wars, and from the 25th of January, you touch wood, will be able to hear it in full as a box set on every podcast channel that you can think of.
Can you do one thing for me before you go? Can you say the word porn for me?
Porn.
Amazing.
Porn.
I can't work out where the intonation comes from.
I don't even know whether I just said it in the way that I say it in the butterfly effect, but I've certainly had people come up to me and go, porn.
Oh no! Sometimes I'll be making a cup of tea, and my wife will sort of slither up behind me and go porn, and I love it.
It's funny. Right. I don't anticipate any of this when I'm recording my voiceovers. I don't know, how it's going to filter into people's heads.
No, it's good. It's good. It's like the only impressions that I can do are Morrissey singing or John Ronson saying the word porn, which is a very niche talent.
It is. It's pretty niche. Although less niche now, because apparently I was on, well, not apparently because I heard it, I was on Dead Ringers the other week, a couple of weeks ago. The sketch was me and Louis Theroux interviewing each other, which frankly they could have done some years earlier. It should have taken them this long to come up with that idea. But it was funny. It made me laugh. I actually laughed out loud listening to it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right, John. Well, listen, take care of yourself, man.
Oh, and you, James, and have a good. I know this is coming out after Christmas, but it's just before Christmas now that we're talking. Have a nice Christmas.
Yes, I will do. I'll do my very best. All right, mate. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.